exactly. We need new ways of looking at everything, essentially. Because, yeah, you made a very interesting and comprehensive summary of the situation of the world, I would say, in a certain sense, because it is a kind of mindset that we have today. But let me also put a bit an emphasis on what you said at the beginning, where you said, I like very much this image, this picture that you had. It's like driving with a car and you look back and you see trees and this and that. These things that now we feel are taking us back, are somehow putting a brake onto evolution. Well, in hindsight, we can also say that they had an evolutionary function, because, for example, positivism, I think it was very good. It was something that humanity needed to get rid of simplistic metaphysics, or even worse, because we had gone through the Inquisition, through the Dark Ages, where people were burnt on the stake because they had some ideas and not others, and so on. So it was probably necessary as a sort of cleansing process that we fall back a bit into this strictly positivist, materialistic, physicalist mindset. And that has served humanity a lot, I think. The problem is that that's typical of the human mind, that once the human mind discovers a partial truth, it tends to generalize it on everything and forever. And then it's difficult to go further and see that this was only a means, something that helped us to get to a certain level, but now we have to leave it behind. It's like the Buddhist parable of the raft, where you go from one shore to the other, and when you have reached the other part of the shore, the raft is useless. You has no sense that you keep it with you. And that's the phase in where we are now with this positivist, because you spoke about behaviorism. I think behaviorism, yes, of course, also behaviorism. Nowadays, I think nobody, or almost nobody, confesses to be a behaviorist, but this has been still, it has been replaced by what I call the neurocentrism. That is, everything is neural now, and if you don't explain things in neuronal processes in your skull, then it's uninteresting. It's still positivism in disguise, and behaviorism in disguise.
Yes. No, it is still the dominant system, that what you get funding for example, if you're in clinical psychology, you get funding for empirically validated therapies, right? And if you're, I mean, people, even like National Institute of Health, NIH or NIMH, National Institutes of Mental Health, have started to open up to, it's about 20, 25 years now, to alternative ways of looking at stuff, but they're still bringing in, funding the kinds of things that sound behavioral and neuroscientism and all of that. I call it neuroscientism because it's not just neuroscience, right? Or neuroscience is really nothing other than what we used to study as physiological psychology. That was basically a field in psychology. It should still be there. Last I checked, I don't know, but it's, neuroscience has become so dominated. But you see, the thing about interpretations that we use in science is that we have to have a little bit of philosophical reflection on all of these things. You can't just use methods and technologies and just go on and on and on. For example, in neuroscience, we know that Well, there are the nerves, there is a place for that in the interface between the mental and the vital, the brain and then the nervous system, I mean, all of these things Sherobin has covered that in his system. There's a place for that.
The physical
But
nerves. Yeah.
yeah, but for example, in the past 30 years, since I was maybe a graduate student or something like that, back in the day, we used to also have these courses, in the 70s. I remember in the 70s, we took courses in physiology and things like that, where all these latest developments were, especially with perception and things like that. And they were just starting to find new centers in the brain and, but this whole evolution of the field because of technologies that allow us to really like functional MRI or many other technologies that now allow us to really go and slice the brain and look at very, very sort of detailed aspects of the brain. We learned a lot, like things like neuroplasticity and things of that sort. But something that's important is that if I want to understand a psychological state, and I've had this conversation in real life with doctors who are actually involved in, situations like depression and all of that. The worldview that depression is caused because of a synaptic miscommunication, because of the lack of a particular neurotransmitter, and to think that that's the only way that you can explain this, and therefore the cure for that is to find a drug that enhances that particular type of brain activity. Well, first of all, if we look at the 30 years of science and all the drugs that have been developed, has depression gone down? No, it's not an overwhelming, it's become even like a huge teenage problem now in the United States. I mean, it's just a huge problem. And what happened to all these drugs? You hope that, in medicine, you hope that when you develop a new technology, something heals, something is cured, right? If you develop, let's say, putting stents, in angioplasty and, it prevents heart attacks and things of that sort. Well, there's evidence that works, right? People now do that all the time. The minute they feel that the arteries are narrowing, because of tests showing, they take it to the hospital and put a stent in there and your life becomes extended, and so that's a good thing, that's a good use of science. But to think that, depression works like that, and to just like constantly throw these different drugs. I know people that are taking 5 or 3 or 4 different types of drugs. And the approach in psychiatry is to actually, they kind of take you in, they diagnose you, and then they say, let's try this drug. Let's see if this works. And if that doesn't work, they up the dosage. And if that doesn't work, they add a second drug. And then they see the combination. And then they look at the dosage again. And then if that doesn't work, they drop one and then add a new one. And it's just like constantly trial and error, because, and so let's look at depression in integral psychology, at least one version of it that I can talk about right now. Well, if we have a whole human being, there are all these different levels. So we have a physical basis, we have a vital basis, we have a mental basis, and we can have at least these 3 different areas. Depression could be connected to one or the other or more. Depression could have a physical cause. Depression could have a vital cause, and depression could have a mental cause. And in fact, there are therapies now that are helping you with some of these things. Like if your depression is primarily due to cognitive function, then cognitive therapy can work. They can help you reframe and look at the world in a different way. And it often has helped people. It's fairly successful, but it may not work for someone else who has a vital issue, vital energy level. And that person, there may be different treatment for that. So there are all these different things. And then there's depression because you have so many bad things happening in your life. You have circumstances life circumstances that are happening. You lose a partner, have this other bad thing happen, and then you have COVID coming in, and for 3 years you can't socialize well. And I mean, all these things happen, and you have, all of a sudden you develop a lot of. But then more importantly, there are types of depression that have something to do with the alienation of the soul
Yeah.
with life. We have to really take that seriously, because oftentimes, in many cases, this alienation, if a person is alienated from life, if they are lucky, they run into some kind of a spiritual teaching that verifies that there's justification for this alienation, because this world is not what you think. The world is full of suffering. It's full of problems. The whole thing is evolving. It's immense, but nobody says this is a heaven here. And we all know that. So if you're having a problem with this, well, good. That means there's something good in you that is not adapting to this craziness, right? So let's look at that. Let's go deeper with that. Let's go on a spiritual path. And then, there may be good things coming out of that. But if you're not lucky, you're thrown into a psychiatric procedural thing, or you're thrown into some other situation where the problem doesn't go away. They give you all these different things, but no therapy seems to work, no drug seems to work, because you're still not sure why you're here on this earth, and so we have to have a multiple perspective on anything like depression or any other issue in psychology. So if you bring that multi-perspectival approach, you can actually really solve a lot of problems that way. At least you begin to see things in a new way, even if you can't solve everything right away, it just widens the perspective, But to just constantly look at, oh, I have found an explanation because this part of the brain we just discovered, this is in charge of that because it lights up in functional MRI, or more blood goes to this part of the brain, so therefore there must be something associated with that. I mean, that's really all, I think, to me, very misdirected, because you have to look at your experience in life and you have to see what's going on inside of your consciousness. You have to look at the content of consciousness. If you're a therapist, or if you're just a person that just wants to self-discover, you have to look at the content of consciousness. These other things are possible things to look at, but you cannot just replace an explanation of this part of my brain lights up under fMRI, and therefore, I have an explanation for my problem, and then you still have the problem. You also have an explanation too, but no solution, right? And often the solutions are things that driven by technology and big business and pharmaceutical and things like that. So there's a lot of different issues.
Of course, yeah. You made a wonderful, again, summary. You are very good in summarizing the concepts, I think, because I just wrote a piece about that entitled Materialism and Psychiatry on my Substack newsletter. Eventually, I can send you the link.
Please.
And among other things, if I may also read a piece of, not from me, but where I cite someone who nicely puts, illustrates what you said, because it's the American psychiatrist Alan Francis. I don't know if you know him.
Alan Francis?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I haven't heard the name.
Okay, in any case, he's a former chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Duke's University School of Medicine in North Carolina, and member of the task force that produced the 4th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so-called DSM-4. Since 1999, he says, since 1999, the National Institute of Mental Health suddenly and radically switched course, embarking on what it tellingly named the decade of the brain. And then, ever since, the NIMH has increasingly narrowed its focus almost exclusively to brain biology, leaving out everything else that makes us human, both in sickness and in health. Having largely lost interest in the plight of real people, the NIMH could now more accurately be renamed the National Institute of Brain Research.
Hmm.
So I find this very interesting. And then there's another psychiatrist who tells what you were telling, that the origin of what we call mental illnesses, whatever that might mean. I don't know exactly. Don't ask me for the definition. But he said that there is a wide range of social and environmental factors that increase the risk of mental ill health. For example, poverty in childhood, early exposure to urban environments, migration and belonging to an ethnic minority, early separation from parents, childhood sexual abuse, physical and emotional abuse, bullying in schools. These are combined with a myriad of adult adversities, such as debt later, when you're grown up, unhappy marriages, excessively demanding work environments, unemployment, stalking, and etc., whatever. So this is something that everyone knows. And if these things are the origin, or at least not always, maybe there are also other kinds, but to a great percentage, I guess, these are the origins of many mental illnesses. It's so obvious that you cannot cure these things with a pill, with some chemical cocktail, because they are not caused by the brain, they are caused by environment. And if you see the brain change, because then they correlate with the brain, the changes in the brain, but there is a causation correlation fallacy, because it is environment, your lifestyle, what you experience in your life, that changes the brain, not the other way around. No?
Yes.
If you think in this purely pharmaceutical viewpoint, you put things upside down, because there's the cause and effect goes in the opposite direction.
Yeah. This is actually exactly what I was going to say in response to what you were saying. I was thinking that there's only one explanation for that, and that is that they think that matter causes consciousness, right? If you believe in this, then, the material formation complex called the brain, it can cause this or it can cause that. So let's focus on this. But I think the problem is that, there's a law of instrument, that when you have an instrument, you tend to use it. That's like, if you give a monkey a hammer, it'll probably start hammering. It doesn't say, oh, let's see what this is for, and then do I need to nail something together now? If I don't, then I'll just put it down. But the monkey basically picks up the hammer, bangs on things, and starts banging until, so when we have something that works, like instruments that technology create for us, it all of a sudden becomes the law of instrument thing, like, because we have this technology, then it becomes our dominant method of going about stuff. We don't question, we don't step back. That's why I'm saying that a bit of philosophical reflection is so important, but scientists are not trained in that. Actually in psychology, if you actually go into the technicalities of psychology, you can see that there are much more sophistication in the training of science. For example, in physics and chemistry and biology, they only talk about, and they don't even talk about it often. They only teach you one particular scale, the scale that has a 0 that means nothing, and then equal divisions, and so on. This is, the basic scale that you measure everything, volume and length and all kinds of things, right? But there are at least five other scales in statistics or in math that can be used, things, they're called nominal and ordinal and interval and all that. The one that's the hard sciences use is called the ratio scale, with 0 and equal divisions. you have the Richter scale is logarithmic scale, and you have actually complex mathematical scales you can build out of any mathematical function. But basically, they don't teach any of that stuff. So they just give you a way to proceed. They don't ask you to reflect on the methodology. They don't ask you to reflect on the epistemology, the kind of knowledge that you're developing. So this is what you get. You get people that are basically trained into laboratory work or experimental work without any kind of questioning of the methods and the tools. And the questions deeper than that, like causality. What is causality? What is multi? You know, if I take some, let's say, some drug right now, you know, some, let's say, LSD or some other drug right now, put it in my mouth, and then half an hour later or 45 minutes later, you study my brain. What do you find? Well, you find that my brain is in a very special condition, right? But can you say that that special condition is causing my behavior, or can you, or should you say that my behavior prior to ingestion of that drug is what caused that biological change in my brain? So not just taking drugs, but in many cases in life, repeated exposure to life conditions, such as the ones that you were enumerating, quoting from that person, you know, like trauma and so many other conditions that we're in, this constant exposures develops the brain chemistry in certain directions, you know, and then you go study, and then you see those things in there, and you think these are the causes of it, right? So this is all, you know, unclear thinking. This is just, you know, wrong-headedness, basically.
In fact, I just wrote an article about the correlation causation fallacy between the mind-brain identity. I will send you the link to this article eventually, where you can find essentially the same reasoning. And I like also very much where you say we need philosophical reflection. And that's something that is also, I would say, a bit in the spiritual environment. When you say this, they, oh, you're too mental, too mental. Yeah, maybe, but we need that. We need that because otherwise we lack of discrimination.
Yeah.
And also in the spiritual practice, you need a discrimination.
Yeah.
Especially when you get into contact with all the complexity of our being and all this integral aspect of our being with this whole person psychology.
Yes.
As you say, the aim is that it becomes also something experiential, not something that you learn in the books. But if you don't have this philosophical underpinning, you sometimes, you have the experience of something, but maybe you don't know what it is, what it means.
And also every level of reality, physical and so many different layers, even the physical. I mean, we just say physical and move on, right? I mean, physical, there are so many physical properties. There's so many states of physical material world that you can't just like drop it and just go like that. But when you say physical or this or that, I think sometimes not properly using the knowledge that we learn. Let's say we reach our Windows books and we learn new terminology and things like that. But, you know, in order to really study the chemical mix-up of two different compounds and the chemical reaction, you don't need a spiritual psychology for that, right? And to bring in some mythological, sort of some convoluted explanation for what's going on here is also another type of problem, you know? Like, I know that some harsh accident happened during a storm and like a tree fell. And, you know, I'm pretty sure basic physics can tell you about the wind and the you know, all these things that happen, and the tree fell and that accident happened. You know, you don't need some kind of a sort of cosmological explanation for this miraculous or non-miraculous thing that happened there. So I think also studying every level of reality needs its own methodology. For physical reality, science is the way to go. Science is actually study of physical world. And then, other realms, you need the appropriate methodologies for that. So I think there's also this sort of spiritualizing of all things, which to me is also another problem. Put a spiritual framework around everything. If something needs a spiritual explanation or understanding, then a spiritual framework helps. But if put a spiritual framework on something, it's like if you're an engineer and you're building a bridge. If someone comes in and tries to sort of, create this spiritual framework around it for you, of course you should reject it. You just say, let me just do my work, because you don't necessarily need that. Yes, there is a higher consciousness in which building a bridge can be seen as a spiritual activity, but it doesn't help the calculation of the formula for the load of that bridge, So there's
I would say that you can find even there something, because especially when some things in engineering or in science fail, they teach you something. There's always a lesson in every failure. And when you take the spiritual perspective also in sending in space a starship, a super rocket, and it explodes, I think there is a lesson. So I think we can find even there a spiritual perspective. But let me a bit wrap up, Bahman, this session with something that I like too much to do with everyone sooner or later, and that is to play the devil's advocate. Because we say here, we should have more philosophical reflection and so on and so on. But now concretely, you are a psychologist or a psychiatrist, you have your studio, and a client comes, and as we have seen, there could be a lot of reasons, because there has been a trauma, an abuse during childhood, or whatever. And now, okay, fine, what is your approach? What makes your integral approach as a psychologist something different? How does it differ from the approach of the traditional psychologist in this everyday practice, where you have to deal with people and the problem of the people, and where they are looking for something that gives them relief, from the perspective of the integral psychologist?
Well, I think if you're talking about clinical work, then, I think there are people that are in the field right now that have been using an integral framework for their clinical work. Brand Kortright, Michael Miovic, there's quite a few other names as well, but and I've listened to them talk about many, many different applications of this larger framework, but I'm not a therapist, so I don't have to deal with that on a professional level. What I do is to look at problems of life pertaining to myself, for example, or situations that I find in life challenging. And I usually find an integral perspective very helpful for me to see different facets of a problem, look at something from multiple levels. But I also find, psychological theory very helpful, to interpret what I run into on a day-to-day basis. So, I think in terms of my actual experience, I did teach integral psychology students a course called Integrative Seminar. And my function was that at the end of their process, like 2.5 years or so of learning everything in an integral, counseling framework, which wasn't something that I taught. There are other professors that taught that. But at this very final seminar, people would come in and I would ask them to look at themselves. I would ask them to look at some principles of psychology, of integral psychology. For example, the principle of um, uniqueness, relatedness, transcendence. The three aspects of life are personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal dimensions of life. I would ask them to look at their life and explore their life stories and life narratives, and look at their life story and see how their life is coming together. Is it coming together? Or how are they becoming whole? How are the different pieces of their life have come together? How their education has helped them in doing that. And then I would ask them to integrate theory and practice, because at that stage in their life, they'd already started doing practice, and asking them to use reflection on experience and try to bring psychological theory and their experience. So my encounter in that area has been to actually work with psychotherapists in training to do that. And it was a very meaningful experience for me. I did it for about 15 years. And that course, I ran all the time, every semester, every quarter. And so I had hundreds and hundreds of students going through this. It was very, very fulfilling just to look at life stories in terms of who I am and how am I evolving, and how can I use a whole person perspective in order to understand my story, and how can I direct the story in a way that it goes in a direction of transformation and evolution, So I think, I can use these things in my personal conversations in some situations in life, but I'm not a psychotherapist to say exactly how I deal with clients in terms of that. But I've heard a lot of students talk about how they deal with their clients from their integral perspective, and there are many integral perspectives. Not all of them are from Sri Aurobindo's perspective, but so, I can answer the question only in this sense that I'm not a practitioner, I'm not a clinician, so I don't have a day-to-day experience. So my experience is, limited in answering that. But people like Michael Mayovic or Brad Cortright, I think they're excellent people to interview because they've seen clients for a very long time, and they use Sri Aurobindo's perspective, for example, with different approaches to integral psychology.
Can you send me the names of those people who are working on it from
Yeah. Actually,
of interpersonal psychology at the clinical
yeah,
level?
there are about a dozen people, and there was a journal that came out in 2018 that has basically a contribution by all of these different people. I can direct you to that journal, and you can see all the names and all their articles, and that's a nice introduction. And Devashish Banerjee published it as a book as well.
I have it. Okay. So I have a direction. Thank you. Yeah. So you say it's about being able to reflect on one's own experience from this integral perspective.
Yes.
Yeah. But this presupposes also a bit of a theoretical background that is given to people that they can at least begin with it.
I would say a little bit. I would say I am kind of skeptical about being well read in integral yoga terminology and trying to use all of those things in terms of reflection, because what you don't want to do, and this is another problem in philosophy of science, right? They say a theory, something that's already in your head, can affect how you see new data, So, your mental framework, like we're not objective in just looking at data as it is. We bring a framework that gives us a way of looking at that data or accessing that data So if you bring a whole framework from Shirazi and try to look at your own experience, it becomes very difficult.
It's theory
I,
linked. Yeah.
yeah, I would recommend something much easier, much simpler, and that would be something like this. Take a piece of integral yoga teachings, for example, a lot of the things that the mother has talked about, right? Take that and then look at your life experience in terms of that teaching, and reflect on it. Let it just sit there, let it be there, and see what comes up and see how you can understand yourself along those lines. I mean, some of the tougher ones are things like ego. That's been a challenge for me for decades now. But I do use that practice. I've become conscious of my ego as it's functioning, because normally it's not something that you're aware of. It's just functioning in a certain way, and you're just looking at life through your mental or vital perspective. But I have become more sensitized to how my ego functions. I've become more aware of types of activities that my ego, but that's because I'm learning something about the ego and I'm applying it to myself. But you could pick any of the various teachings, but pick only one thing, at a time, and I would approach the literature same way. I wouldn't create a list of Haridas teachings and try to read everything. I would just say, that's an interesting book, just open it up to even somewhere in the middle or in the end, and find something that you resonate with, and then read around that, and then put it down, and then try to see how that plays out in your own life,
Yeah.
So I think, that's a little bit, and then so these reflections over time can help you create your own theoretical framework that you want to have, but don't get attached to it. Don't crystallize it into a permanent sort of way of looking at things. Just look at it as something in the process, and then use it to see how things are going, and then keep modifying it, and then drop it.
Yeah.
Then drop it. When you know something, you don't need that.
You do.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree on that. It's something we should not rationalize and put things into boxes. And nowadays we have this. I unfortunately have this a bit habit also still, that we create these mind maps. It's almost obsessive compulsive that we have to put everything in a mind map and then present it to others, hoping that they see the integral view, but they don't see it.
I mean, there's, like you said, there's a way of looking at everything and seeing something good in it or some function in it. And I think there is, as long as you're aware that it's a mental map, and you're able to transcend it right away, and you're not attached to it. Sri Aurobindo's I guess formula for inner observation was to do it dispassionately and without judgment. So dispassionate means without attachment.
Attachment, yeah.
So whatever you see, just allow it to arise, take note of it, and sometimes a mental map might emerge around it, but just be aware that it's a map, and then just continue. You don't want to go to the place where, there's a famous joke about maps and reality map and territory,
Yeah.
And the two mountain climbers get lost in the mountains, and they look around, there's all these different mountains and peaks and so on, and one of them says, I'm totally lost, I'm not sure. It takes out the map, looks very carefully, look at the whole environment, and says, according to this map, we're on that peak. This is when you're lost. Not only physically, but mentally, you're lost.
Yeah, it's the mind that is a grip of the mind, and this is also another aspect where we have to get not rid of it. We have to transcend the mind without losing our mind.
Yes.
And that's the big art and challenge.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like you said in the beginning, there's a difference between mind and consciousness, right?
Yeah.
One way to think about it as mental consciousness is one kind of consciousness among many other types of consciousness. But it's also that you can bring consciousnus to observing the mind, you know. So there's a distinction there, you know, when you have like almost like a so-called purusha or witness, you know,
Witness. Yeah, yeah,
you have a
yeah.
witness to the activity that's emerging in you. You know, normally we're not aware because we're so much in the mind realm that when something happens, we're in that realm with it. But to be able to step back, and eventually this becomes such a practice that you become more consciousness and less maps,
Yeah.
and to the point that where these things become so temporary and so ephemeral that they just like disappear right away, or sometimes they don't even arise anymore because you're in this more intuitive, more witness consciousness place that is seeing everything as it is not making any connection to it, is not having any kind of vital outreach to it or vital connection to it or any mental connection to it or anything. You just basically observe things as they are. And in fact, Sri Aurobindo has said at one point that sometimes you can get to very high levels of consciousness by just allowing a parade of these things come in front of you, almost like the whole world comes and parades in front of your consciousness until they all expire, you know, because they all have a certain energy, they all have a particular existence. But as we feed them through our vital and mental energy, they sustain. We sustain them through our input of energy. But if you just observe them flat, they lose their energy, you know, they lose their reality and they dissipate.
That's what I also my experience when I speak with philosophers of mind that conflate mind and consciousness. I don't try to explain it in rational terms. I try to bring them in a first person perspective and say, look, is it not your experience that mind, mental events, thoughts come and go and come and go? We think continuously, there's always something that we think about, but it's always something different and that comes and goes. And yet, isn't there something, someone, a witness that is immutable and sees these things coming and going? Nobody
No,
no longer refutes this. And then they understand it because we are able to bring them into a first person perspective. But as long as you try to explain this with a third person perspective of science or from an empirical point of view, they refuse. No, mind and consciousness is just synonymous. It's just the same thing. So I find that we are here on the same wavelength very much. Yeah. And Bahman, this is all super, super, super interesting, and I would go on for hours and hours, but we have already, I think, more 1.5 hours now discuss these things. I would say we can wrap it for today and wrap it up. And thank you so much for being with me, with us, on our podcast here. I think it is will be absolutely useful also, not just interesting, but also useful for people who are watching at these podcasts. And is there a place, do you have a website or contact information also? I don't know, Twitter account
I don't have a personal
yeah,
website, but yeah, I have email for contact that
yeah,
you can use my email for contact. Yeah,
yeah. So eventually people can ask us, and then we eventually can send them the emails. If
sure,
someone
sure.
has some
I'd be happy
questions, I
to.
would like to know more.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Well,
Okay,
thank you so much, Marco. This
thank you, Bob.
definitely it's a pretty big topic, and I feel that we had a kind of a global introduction to integral psychology. We did not go into any
Yeah,
area, you know, specifically to discuss any aspect, but I think we kept sort of integral psychology in the larger sort of picture of everything. And I really think that these um, conversations can eventually become more specific if we want to take it in a certain direction. But I think
Yeah.
it was very nice. I enjoyed the conversation in terms of making the connection to science and just different ways of knowing and different ways
Yeah.
of being. So I think people who know integral yoga terminology or integral yoga to some extent can fill in a lot of their own
Oh,
knowledge,
yeah.
you know, and sort of back it up. So there's really no technicality or no specific topic or area of integral psychology that we discussed, but we discussed it as a global topic.
Yeah. At an intuitive level, and that
Yes,
is more than sufficient to feel what it is about. The details can come after, but they're not so necessary at the beginning. Okay, thank
great.
you very much, Bahman.
Yes, thank
Please
you. And
remain online for a moment.